Simply put, the flatter you are on the bench, the more straight your wrist is going to be, because when your rib cage is flat, there has to be a flat surface to also, like physics wise, there has to be a stack, right? Your shoulder has to match your wrist, which also has to match the line of action. Your rib cage is your line of action. So for example, if I'm completely flat, my line of action is straight up. Whereas, if you see a larger arch, things like that, you're changing the direction at which something is facing. So as I change the direction of my rib cage, I'm gonna have to change the direction of my wrist, because I'm now directing the force in that direction. So again, the larger the arch, typically the more wrist extension is needed in order to even balance the bar in the first place. And that's what we see a lot, is you'll see people that want to have their wrist straight, but then they're angling this way. So if I'm at an angle and my wrists are straight, I'm gonna be pushing the bar that way. And we don't want to push the bar that way. We want to push the bar this way, likely somewhere in this direction, not away from us. So this wrist extension is what allows us to actually balance the bar. The other thing to mention is shoulder position plays a role in where these wrists are going to be facing as well. Because say I have my shoulders more elevated, right? Even if I have a big arch, if my shoulders are elevated, what's going to occur is my wrist can actually be a little bit straighter as well, because I'm facing more flat and straight. Whereas, if we're doing it the way that is more correct, I would say, or just makes bench a little bit easier, we're gonna get our shoulders down, but then we're gonna have our wrist cocked back so that we can actually leverage the stack, and where the wrist and the weight can actually line up with your shoulder. So if we do it right, what's gonna happen is we're gonna want our wrist to already be a little bit more bent if we're gonna be arching a lot. So we're gonna get our wrist kind of preloaded in that bent position, because we already know that that's where we're gonna be. So instead of having our wrist straight, and then when the bar comes out having to roll, you might even see a roll. Some people even roll on purpose, but it's easier to simply be in that position already and then unrack the bar in that position than to have a straight wrist and then have to roll it back into position. So simply put, we're gonna flex our wrists into the bar. Wrist wraps usually help with this process, especially when it gets a little heavier. Shoulders in position, flex the wrist, unrack the bar. There are people that really enjoy having no wrist wraps. And a lot of times you'll see those are the individuals whose shoulders aren't as depressed as others. So their shoulders are usually more out, and they're like, man, it feels so much better when my wrists aren't being cocked back. And it's like, well, it's a reflection of not just the rib cage, but your shoulder position. So things always tend to make sense when you start to look at the shoulder, you start to look at the wrist, and you start to look at the angle at which someone is pressing. So if a person enjoys pressing with their shoulders up here, you wouldn't want to correct them by telling them to bend their wrist, because bending their wrist would actually, if their shoulders are up here and you bend your wrist, you're just pressing towards your face at that point, because it's bringing it that way. So always look at the shoulder, always look at the angle of action, and then look at the wrist, instead of, oh, your wrist isn't bent back, oh, your wrist should be straight. It's like, no, the wrist is a reflection of the resultant of everything else. So Jesus here doesn't have the biggest arch ever, but when he slides in, you'll notice that he's just loading his wrist into there. He knows that if his wrist is too straight, it's gonna dump forward. So he loads into the bar by bending his wrist, and then there you go. See, he unracks the bar, then his wrist finally finishes. A little bit of rolling, not too bad. Not too bad, pretty good. And sometimes what you'll see is, you see how his wrist was bending more and more. So what actually started to happen was his shoulders started to come out a little bit, and then his wrist was like, okay, we'll help you position that to stay even. So you'll see some wrists sometimes they'll change during the set because the position of the shoulders and the rib cage are changing during the set. Ideally, you don't want anything to change. Ideally, you want to be set in the perfect position, and you want to be set and just have everything just right. Most people, usually you only have to be effective for a set of 1 in competition, so that's okay. But over the course of reps, you'll see form breakdown, and form breakdown isn't necessarily bad, I would say. It's just a natural occurrence. Your ability to not break down is actually going to be how good you are at reps. Your ability to push reps consistently is going to be what ends up being your most healthy, training stimulus.